So I'm going to talk a little bit more specifically about how I decide to do what I'm doing when I color match skin tones, because I got a request saying that one of the valuable things about trying to do skin tone matching in this kind of activity is in knowing what it is that I'm thinking about when I'm trying to do the skin tone matching. So I'm going to talk less about the technical aspects here of how to do things and more what I am thinking about in the moment when I try to do this matching. So in the previous video, one of the things I talked about was moving the face over so that you can actually see both faces so that you can match better. You can see that there is a difference in skin tone. All right, so I'm going to start to do what I would normally do and just talk while I'm doing it so that you can hear what I'm thinking. Okay. First thing I'm thinking is that there's a difference in color and a difference in brightness and contrast here. So I'm assuming based on the way the photograph was taken, there are greater differences between the bright areas and the dark areas than there are in the Will Ferrell image. That means that maybe contrast will help me. And it's clear that Danny DeVito's face is a little bit brighter colored. Okay, so that means that what I probably need to do, to start at least, is to create a new adjustment layer for brightness and contrast. I'm going to take the default name, and then clip it to the layer below by holding down the Alt key and clicking on the border between the two layers so that the edits that I make only apply to Danny DeVito's face. All right, so if I play with the brightness, you can see that I don't need to make it brighter. And as I make it darker, some of the dark areas become almost too dark, which is telling me that's one of the indications to me that there's a contrast issue here. So I don't want to just adjust the brightness, I want to also adjust the contrast. All right, so now as I do this, this is the first place that I'm encountering this phenomenon of not knowing exactly where you want to drag the slider because you're looking for something that is closer to the skin tone you're trying to match. Okay? And when I say that I'm looking for that, obviously I'm not completely aware of everything that my eye is detecting and that my is triggering my brain to think that I'm not done. Okay? I'm not completely aware of that. Having a trained eye sometimes means that you are doing things and making decisions that you don't verbalize. Okay. However, I'm going to try to verbalize them for you as much as I can, but please forgive me if there's something that you're not seeing that I'm seeing that I miss when I'm talking about it. But you will gain that same kind of ability the more you practice at doing this. Okay. That is one of the things that is not directly taught to people. It is a skill that you gain by practicing with your eye and your hand. In a way, it's hand-eye coordination, but it's really eye and uh, Photoshop slider coordination. Okay, so if I make it a little darker here, I don't like the way the dark areas are now standing out more. So you can see if I drag to the extremes of contrast, if I drag to the right, the dark areas stand out even more. If I drag to the left, they start to fade. Okay? Not in a perfect way. Like one of the things you're getting when I drag to the right is the colors are actually matching. Like I'm seeing more color, in a way that makes sense, okay? But that color isn't a contrast problem. That color is a color problem. We're going to address it with a layer that lets us edit the color directly, okay? If we tried to fix it here, we'd find that just using this adjustment layer, we have some serious problems that we cannot address, like the darkness of these dark areas because I increased the contrast. Okay, so no one control is going to give you exactly the match that you want. What that means is you've got to use one control to get it as close as you can, and then move on to another control to see if you can address some other aspect of it, but you might need to go back and forth. And what complicates this is that even if I go back and forth between these two sliders, there are other types of controls that I'm going to need to mess around with in order to get this closer. Namely, I'm going to need to change the color. All right, so what am I actually thinking, and what could you be thinking if you're doing this edit? Can I mentally ignore the color while I focus on the brightness and contrasts? If I can, I'm going to be able to do this part of the editing a lot better. Okay, will I be 100% accurate? Probably not. But if I look at the skin and pretend that I can't see that there is a color difference in the amount of like orange and red and whatever, then I think I can get something that is a little bit closer. You can always also look back and see what you started with versus what you have now. What I started with, at first, when I had Danny DeVito's face over Will Ferrell's, I actually didn't think, well, for a moment, I didn't think that it was a very poor match. But once I've started adjusting it, now you can see that it is a much better match with respect to brightness and contrast, even though the colors don't match. All right, so I'm going to consider this a pretty decent adjustment for the brightness and contrast. What I did was I reduced the brightness. You can see it was way too bright. And then I adjusted the contrast because once I was adjusting the brightness, the dark areas stood out way too much. So it toned down the dark areas to drag them to where they are here. Okay, that's my brightness and contrast edit. So being done with that, I now want to create another adjustment layer, adjusting something that's going to address the color differences. So in my experience, that's going to be color balance or hue and saturation. And I'm not sure which one to go to first because, well, I'm not exactly sure. So let's take a look. Hue and saturation. Hue lets you set a specific hue in this kind of spectrum and then adjust the saturation and lightness. Okay, let's look at color balance. Color balance lets you adjust these sliders between opposing colors, red and the opposing cyan, green and its opposing magenta, blue and its opposing yellow. Okay, these are different ways of editing color that act somewhat similar, and I can't give you a theory for which one to choose. I think it's best for you to experiment with which one you like, but I can show you what I'm doing while I edit with them. Additionally, you might find that you get to a point where you want to not only edit the saturation, okay, you might decide that the vibrance is helpful to you as well. So we may come back and do a vibrance layer as well. But for now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to apply, we're going to pick one of these. We'll start with hue and saturation. We'll apply it to just the layer below it, the clip, and we'll start to fiddle around with it. Okay, so as I drag to the left, I get more of a red, pink, magenta cast to the face, and if I drag to the right, blue is being introduced, which causes it to look a little bit greenish and sickly. Okay, these are not great. This is not really giving me the feeling that I'm getting closer to what I want. Okay, I could drag it way over here, but now I've got like a color replacement that's ridiculous. So I don't think hue and saturation is going to do it for me. Maybe there's a place in there around here that's better. Maybe changing the saturation helps, okay, and the lightness. But to be honest, I don't love this. And so I'm going to close this window and I'm going to hide that hue saturation layer. I don't think the overall difference was desirable. So I'm going to do a color, I'm going to apply the color balance to the layers below, and then I'm going to edit via color balance. Okay, this one's much more easy for me to like mentally think about, okay? Because I can see that there's more orange here. Okay, that's a combination of yellow and red. So my initial thought is that I want to add some red maybe, and I want to add some yellow so that I can get a slightly more orange color. Now, this would be on the red-orange side of orange. That's what my eyes are telling me. So as I add more red, I'm going to watch for other things that are happening simultaneous. Like, for instance, my eye is telling me that as I add more red, there's a little bit of kind of magenta-y, plum-looking color that's being added. That's, I'm relying on my eyes detecting that change, which makes me think that if I can't fix that by adding yellow, I might want to also add some green to counteract the magenta. Okay, so why did I say fix it by adding yellow? Because the pure red is red. It's not orange, and we know that this is kind of like looking orangey. So I know that I have to add yellow to try to approach that color. Okay, so now I'm here. I've got an orange Danny DeVito face, and it's not great because it is almost too colorful, and it's still not pink enough. It's not pink enough, which means I need to add more red. And look at what's happening. That is not great, that red. The way it's becoming red is not great. Okay, why? Because the red is too vibrant. This is where I'm starting to think I have a saturation or vibrance issue going on that I'm not going to be able to fix with these sliders. I can add a little bit of green in, maybe that helps a little, but you can see I'm still not there. Is this an improvement? Yeah, but it's just too much in your face, so to speak, vibrance. Okay, so what am I going to do? I'm going to add a vibrance editing layer, and now this will allow me to test my theory out that maybe there's just too much color, which is saturation is going to let me address that. Okay, if there's too much color, so I can drain the color completely out. That's not what I want, obviously. But if I turn the color down a little bit, do I get closer to Will Ferrell's face? It feels like maybe I do. It looks like maybe I do. Okay, let's try vibrance. I honestly don't have saturation. Clearly saps the color from an image. What does vibrance do? Vibrance also kind of saps the color, but you can see that it doesn't sap it all the way. So it's a different kind of color tone downness. So if I tone this vibrance down, see how it's looking a little bit more similar? I can also tone the saturation down, but I think the vibrance actually addressed the problem. Now what's different about it? Well, again, it looks like I don't have enough orange color. You could say, but Dr. Burke, you removed that orange color with the vibrance. Well, there's nothing saying that I can't go back to color balance and try to see what I can do to maybe I want more orange color, but I don't want it to be so vibrant like that. Okay? This is for me, this is a pretty decent match, I think. If I go to brightness and contrasts, is it still a little bit too bright? Maybe it is. Okay, get the contrast down a little bit. Don't want it to be too dark. Okay, now I think I'm at the point where, so I got rid of the hue and saturation layer. I'm just going to delete that. Just delete that layer. And so you look, if I hide all these layers, this is where I started. And putting those edits back in, this is where I ended up. Okay, now hopefully speaking aloud gave you an idea of what I was thinking of while I was doing it. Did I make a good match? I think it's a lot closer. I mean, to me, it is pretty clear that it is a lot closer. Is it perfect? It's probably not going to be perfect, but I feel like there's a lot less of an obvious border around his face now. I think maybe the vibrance is still a little too high. I don't know. Once you put it in place, I suggest doing another set of changes. So I could go back to vibrance, no problem, and Desaturate it a little bit? No. Turn the vibrance down a little bit? I don't know. Maybe it needs more. Maybe it needs to be more warm. I brought back a little bit of the vibrance. Okay. I see more yellow. Well, now that I've got these things up against each other, I see more yellow over there. I know how to deal with that. Go to the color balance. Add a little bit more yellow in. Okay. Maybe it just needed more yellow all along, and I couldn't tell. Knock back the red a little bit. Okay. So hopefully from this video, what you heard was that when I'm doing that matching, I'm constantly reevaluating the color. And I'm trying to imagine that I'm only focusing on the things that I'm editing in the moment and ignoring the effects of the other kinds of edits. For instance, when I was editing brightness and contrast, I tried not to think about color. When I was editing color balance, I tried not to think about the brightness and contrast. And I didn't think about vibrance until I was getting near the end and realized I was reaching a point of diminishing returns. So that's what happens. At first, you do big edits and you find that you can't do the fine adjustment isn't there. It's not possible to get what you're looking for. So you add on another type of edit. You do some big edits, you get down to some fine adjustments, and then you realize fine adjustments aren't going to do it for you, and maybe you need to look at another thing. And in part, you're also relying on the ability to go back to earlier adjustments. Now, when the color is fixed, then you can readdress, you can go back and look at brightness and contrast again because you were just ignoring brightness and contrast before, but now you can actually see, you were just ignoring color before, and now you can go back and adjust the brightness and contrast since you have a closer color, and you can see if if you can get more successful that way. So there's a lot of iteration, it's a lot of going back, and it's a lot of using your eye to see what it is you see. Do you see more yellow? Do you see more orange? So that's red and yellow. Do you see too much red? Do you need to pull back on the plum color, by adding more green in, etc. I hope that helps. That's a lot more of my thought process. It's a bit of a longer video, but that is what I'm thinking of when I edit the color for color matching purposes.